and oppressed communities to bring their voices and demands into City Hall is precisely what Councilmember Sawant was elected to do, not once, but 3 times now by the voters in her district. Taken together, these charges represent a serious and deeply worrying attack on the right to peacefully protest at a moment when more Americans are participating in protests than ever before. As Councilmember Sawant has said since these recall charges were first filed, this is not just an attack on her, but on the Black Lives Matter movement specifically, and on the progressive movement overall. We have a number of speakers here this morning who are all activists and leaders in their communities who will be speaking to this issue, and we'll try to keep it pretty tight so we can get through it all in a timely manner. And then Councilmember Sawant will be speaking at the end, and following that, we will have some time for questions for her and for Brian Coloris, the spokesperson for the Shama Solidarity Campaign. So the first speaker I'm going to introduce is Natalia McConnell. Natalia is a student activist and current freshman class president at Franklin High School. She has led 2 climate walkouts and a Black Lives Matter protest, and organized support to run Seattle public school buses by the district rather than by a for-profit company. Go ahead, Natalia.
Hi, my name's Natalia McConnell, and I'm part of a generation that's growing up under a broken system and we've been fighting back, organizing protests and walkouts for the Black Lives Matter movement, for climate justice, and more. And unlike most politicians, Shama has been there with us. 2 years ago, other students and I were fed up with the late and no-show school buses due to the bus company's short staffing. The private for-profit bus company didn't pay the drivers good wages or provide benefits, and often didn't provide wheelchair-accessible buses for field trips. We decided to take action and collected more than 1,000 signatures from students to the Seattle School Board, demanding that the district run school buses by the district, not a for-profit company. Shama joined us at the school board meeting to help us present the petition. She spoke alongside us in support of our cause. Later that year, I attended a press conference Shama held outside Washington Middle School in advance of the September 20th climate strike. I was inspired by her and went back to Mercer and began organizing. In 2 days, I and other students managed to get 200 students to walk out of school in the middle of the day. We joined the rally at Cal Anderson Park and marched downtown. It was amazing seeing the thousands of people outside City Hall demanding a Green New Deal, something that Shama has been fighting for on a local level. But Shama didn't just talk about a Green New Deal because it was an election year. She didn't just make empty statements of support. She used her seat to fight for a tax on Amazon and Seattle's biggest businesses to fund affordable housing and Green New Deal programs. Last summer, millions of people protested to demand justice for George Floyd. I and other students wanted to organize a Black Lives Matter protest to defund police and remove cops from schools. We planned to organize just a virtual protest with students walking out of their homes at the same time and holding signs on their street corners. But as we got organized, other students heard about it, and it turned into hundreds of students around Seattle gathering on the streets. It inspired other Black Lives Matter protests in the South End in the next few weeks. And Shama was there fighting alongside us from the start. Ultimately, we successfully pressured the Seattle School Board to meet our demand of removing cops from schools. But again, unlike most politicians, Shama didn't just make empty statements of support. Shama has been the only council member who has continued to fight to defund the police by at least 50%, to invest in the community, and for elected community oversight of the police. Shama has been there with us again and again, actually working alongside us, fighting for the change we need and winning. That's why the right wing and big business are trying so hard to drive her out of office with this recall campaign. Shama is the champion of the working class that we need on city council. And that's why I know that I and so many others will do everything we can to once again defend Shama's seat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Robert Jeffrey, the pastor of the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. Go ahead whenever you're ready, Dr. Robert Jeffrey. Okay, it looks like Dr. Jeffrey might not actually be with us yet, so we will go ahead and try to come back to him later in the list. But the next speaker we can go to is Sharon Crowley. Sharon is an organizer and member of UAW 4121, the union representing academic student workers at the University of Washington. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thanks, Kaylin. Thanks for having me here today. As Kaylin said, I'm Sharon Crowley. I'm an organizer and a member with UAW Local 4121, and that's the union for academic student employees and postdocs at the University of Washington. Today, I'm here to stand in solidarity against this racist, anti-democratic, big business funded recall campaign. We all have to stand in solidarity against this. It sucks that we have to keep doing this, but we keep winning, so we can keep doing it, I guess. I'm a union member and I'm a Seattle renter. In 2019, I was excited to vote for Shama and to volunteer with her campaign as she ran against a candidate who was backed by these same big businesses, the same money. She is and has always been a tireless champion for working people. She's an organizer, she's a movement builder, and she gets things done. And we all know that's what's behind this recall. Billionaires and corporate executives know that Shama is both principled and effective, that her city council office is a space where working people, marginalized people, and vulnerable people are always the top priority. More importantly, she listens to us, she fights for our needs, and she wins. This scares them. I'm sorry they're scared, but not. Good. Actually, they should be scared. Shama's work isn't about winning small, isolated victories. As a movement builder who understands that organizing is not just how we win, it's how we create real structural change for working and vulnerable people. That's the real threat here. As a voter, this recall campaign really pisses me off. I can't sugarcoat that. I mean, these obscenely wealthy and powerful people are trying to undo my vote and all of your votes. It's a cynical attempt to undermine our democratic rights and ultimately to accelerate their ability to keep accumulating wealth and ultimately to keep accumulating wealth, even now during a pandemic which has dragged on for more than a year and has created overlapping crises that are falling hardest on the most vulnerable among us. Where are the billionaires to help us when we need them? They're not here when we need them. They're only here to fight against the people who are here for us all the time. Make no mistake as well, their wealth comes from us. It's our sweat and our work that lines their pockets. This is why I'm here today, standing in solidarity with Shama. She has been here standing in solidarity with us, fighting with us and for us. We are a movement and we will continue organizing. We know how to win. We've been here before. Unfortunately, we'll probably be here again, but standing together, we can defeat this attack and we can defeat future attacks. So let's keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Our next speaker is Don Creary, who will be speaking on behalf of the Drivers Union. Don, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. My name's Don Creary. I'm on the board of the Drivers Union. I'm a founding member of the Drivers Union. I've been working to organize Uber and Lyft drivers for about 7 years now. In September of last year, Uber and Lyft drivers in Seattle won a long struggle for greater pay and rights. This is a fight that took several years. From the beginning of this fight to the point of our victory in September, Shama Sawant stood with us. I mean, actually, in hindsight, I realized, before many of us drivers started this struggle, Shama was already there. In 2013 and 2014, when Uber and Lyft first arrived in Seattle, it was Shama who had the foresight to realize that the promises that they were making, the pay they were giving us was disingenuous, that they were eventually going to take this away and they needed to be regulated. And it was Shama in those early days that was tried to regulate them. And she was pretty much by herself trying to do this, but she had the vision at that time. So late in 2014, when many drivers began to stand to fight against the pay cuts that these companies were imposing on us, who was already standing there ready to fight? Who had already been fighting? It was Shama Sawant, ready there to help us. So later in 2015, when we first started our union, our very first meeting, Shama was there at the meeting. We got a great deal of support. I believe we had a lot of membership due to the presence of Shama Sawant. She inspires confidence. In the years that followed, there were times that it seemed like we were not going to prevail in this fight. I mean, I recall 2017, 2018 in particular, seemed very, very bleak. It seemed to me that the legal political structure that we were working within to try and get drivers' rights and workers' rights was really designed to prevent workers from getting rights. We didn't give up. And I believe one of the main reasons we did not give up is that Shama Sawant was on our side. She inspired great confidence in us. And I believe that we just thought, how can we lose when we have Shama on our side? So finally, in September of this year, we won a 40% pay increase for drivers, and unprecedented in the rest of the country. Seattle is the only city in which we drivers are going to have legal representation against unfair deactivations, which is something that these companies engage in wantonly, capriciously, and drivers are now going to have protection against that. I believe that ultimately these victories are going to be as significant as the $15 minimum wage, which Shama Sawant was also significant in making happen. And going forward, we in the drivers union want to extend these rights to all members of the gig economy, all workers in the gig economy. And we know that in this fight, Shama Sawant is going to be right next to us fighting. The billionaires know this as well. There is nothing a billionaire loves more than a worker who has no rights. And I can think of no one who stands in greater opposition to this than Shama Sawant. So once again, they're going to try and buy a seat on the city council. They failed in 2019, but they never lose faith in their money. Let's be clear. I mean, these charges are so ludicrous, they could only get traction because there's a lot of money behind them. So members of the Drivers Union, Teamsters Local 117, we stand with Shama Sawant against this recall. We will stand with Shama Sawant in this fight, which is a fight against this attack on democracy. This is an attack on democracy. We're seeing them all across the country. This is the same as the attack on voters' rights in Georgia. So we will stand with Shama in this fight. And when we fight Shama, we win. Solidarity, Sister Shama. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. Our next speaker is Brian Caloris. Brian is a spokesperson for the Shama Solidarity Campaign. Go ahead, Brian.
In the last few years, we've seen the dramatic growth of the socialist left here in the US. It's no surprise that this comes at a time when capitalism is failing on so many fronts. We have ongoing economic crisis, ongoing environmental crisis, and an ongoing health crisis. It's also no coincidence that the socialist left is growing at the time that mass movements are coming onto the scene and coming onto the agenda. We've seen the Justice for George Floyd, Black Lives Matter uprising, and now we see the beginnings of unorganized workers getting organized with the workers in Alabama at Amazon in the forefront. And if you study history, then it's no surprise to us the response of the billionaire class of their state against these movements and against the socialist left growing. It's undemocratic repression with 14,000 Black Lives Matter protesters arrested across the country. And here in Seattle, Mayor Durkan illegally having police use tear gas on protesters. And if we had any wonder about what side the courts and the Supreme Courts are on, we can see when Mayor Durkan and her police tear gas protesters, including Shama herself, the recall against Mayor Durkan has been thrown out, yet these untrue, spurious charges against Shama go ahead for a recall campaign. We can see what side they're on. This is an undemocratic, alarming attempt to criminalize the right to protest, and it's also voter suppression as well. But the way that the socialist left and movements are dealt with aren't always just ham-fisted repression. They aren't always just undemocratic measures. Another tactic that's used is to try and co-opt our movement, to try and co-opt our struggle. And elected socialists have been developing all across the country in a tremendous step forward. And the establishment over time will try and tell them to play nice, that yes, you can use some of your rhetoric on some days, but don't rock the boat too much. Don't call us out too much. Here, you get a cushy salary. Don't use your office to build movements. And Kshama and SA set a different example, that we say who the corporate backed Democrats are. We call them out when they betray. Kshama takes the wage of an average worker, builds movements, and that socialism and class struggle aren't just for Saturday speeches, but for every minute to win victories. And what they're afraid is that this example of leadership will spread, just as the $15 an hour minimum wage movement spread, just as the tax Amazon victory spread. They're afraid of this spreading, and so that's why they want to use their repression and undemocratic methods in order to try and take Kshama out.
Thank you, Brian. We have two more speakers, Castile Hightower, and then Kshama will speak, and then we will have about 10 minutes for questions at the end, and we're hoping to be over by about 9:15. So yes, as I said, our next speaker is Castile Hightower. Castile is a police accountability activist and the sister of Herbert Hightower Jr., who was shot and killed by Seattle police while experiencing a mental health crisis. Whenever you're ready, Castile.
Thank you, Kaylin. 16 years ago, my brother, Herbert Hightower Jr., was shot and killed by Seattle police while experiencing a mental health crisis. Inspired by the Justice for George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movements across this country, I decided it was time to fight back. After reaching out to multiple organizations, I was lucky enough to be welcomed and supported by the principled and effective leadership of Kshama Sawant. Her unwavering commitment to fight the injustices that allowed my brother not only to be murdered by SPD, but for his killer to then be promoted to assistant chief years later proved to me that an elected representative such as Kshama Sawant is not only rare, but a threat to the now emboldened, racist, and undemocratic right-wing establishment. And it's also why we need to show up for her like she has showed up for so many marginalized communities time and time again. With victories such as passing the Amazon tax, increasing the minimum wage to $15, a first in the nation ban on chemical weapons against protesters, and landmark renters' rights laws make it clear whose interests are at the heart of this recall effort. Now in the thick of the Derek Chauvin trial, uncovering the horrendous details that led to the death of George Floyd, learning how 6 Seattle police officers participated in the attack on the Capitol, with SPD essentially being allowed to investigate themselves, and SPD continuing to murder people experiencing mental health crises rather than giving them the help they need. The time is now for us to show up and show out for one of the most truly progressive and effective leaders of our time. So join me, join us in saying not on our watch will police brutality and murder continue. Not on our watch will illegal and heartless evictions occur. Not on our watch will the exploitation of working class people go unchallenged. And not on our watch will the undemocratic attempt to do over the 2019 election of Kshama Sawant's victory be allowed. Let's fight this recall effort and continue to win victories for the working class, our houseless neighbors, and all marginalized people across the state and across this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Castile. Our final speaker will be Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant. Go ahead, Kshama.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the moving words that came before me. This ruling is completely unjust, but we are not surprised. Working people and oppressed communities know that we cannot rely on the capitalist courts for justice any more than we can on the police. Many working people saw this firsthand last summer in Seattle and across the country as peaceful protests against racist police brutality were themselves met with brutal police violence. The police and the political establishment have yet to be held accountable, while in stark contrast, more than 14,000 protesters were arrested. I was one of the protesters, of course, and it's no accident that 2 of the 3 charges upheld by the Supreme Court are about my participation in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. In October, the Washington State Supreme Court unanimously threw out the grassroots recall of Amazon's mayor, Democrat Jenny Durkan, who oversaw the vicious police crackdown against Seattle protesters. Among other weapons, Seattle police under Durkan used tear gas during a respiratory pandemic. Tear gas inflames the lungs, burns the skin, and stings the eyes. Its use has the potential to increase the spread of the coronavirus and to cause long-term harm in individuals with asthma or other respiratory conditions. Democratic administrations like Durkan's continued unleashing tear gas for weeks throughout the nation, despite repeated public pleas by medical and public health professionals to stop its use, especially during COVID. Yet the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the recall's objection to the use of tear gas by Durkan's administration really represented a quote unquote political disagreement with Durkan and therefore did not have merit and summarily dismissed the case. Now, this same Supreme Court has unanimously approved the recall against Seattle's only elected socialist because we held a masked 1-hour Black Lives Matter rally in an empty city hall. The Supreme Court's real reason for siding with the recall is highly political. It is an attack on our office for unambiguously standing with the Black Lives Matter movement. The stunning irony is that I was one of the hundreds who was tear gassed by Durkan's police. The Supreme Court has thrown out a whole series of recall cases for establishment politicians, including the COVID safety denying sheriff of Thurston County, John Snaza. Sheriff Snaza refused to require his police officers to wear masks in the midst of this historic pandemic, putting ordinary people in even greater danger than usual at the hands of the police. The hypocrisy is on every level breathtaking. This recall ruling against our Socialist Council office could not be more political. It's a blatant attack on working people, social movements, and ultimately on the right to protest. This ruling criminalizes protest and sets an extremely dangerous precedent. The third charge, of course, was about my support for the Tax Amazon movement. This charge is beyond farcical. I am accused of spending public resources on the issue of taxing Amazon and big business because months later it became a possible ballot initiative issue. In other words, I am accused of using public resources on a non-existing ballot initiative and ultimately an initiative that never even went on the ballot. This is another dangerous precedent. How can working class elected representatives use their office to organize on progressive issues? Any progressive issue may sometime in the future result in a ballot initiative. We cannot make sense of this twisted logic without recognizing that the real intent of such ludicrous charges is to have a chilling effect. If working people and movements dare to have our own elected positions that organize for our interests, the ruling class will ruthlessly retaliate. It is appropriate this ruling came out yesterday on April Fool's Day because this ruling makes a mockery of any kind of justice. But of course, under capitalism, the idea of fair treatment under the law for working people, people of color, women, and the poor has always been a cruel joke. I've talked to many ordinary working people during these past months who did not want to believe that the Washington State Supreme Court could be capable of such an unjust decision. Like every other institution under capitalism, the court's fundamental purpose is to serve the interests of those with wealth and power against those who have little or none. Washington State's recall law is itself both profoundly undemocratic and unequally applied. It is well suited for retaliation against working people's representatives, in part because there is no requirement that the charges even be proven true. And I will never even be provided an opportunity to defend myself in court against these falsehoods. The truth is not relevant, we are told. This gives Washington's courts enormous leeway to use recall elections as a mechanism to defend the ruling class and capitalist system, greenlighting cases against the left while dismissing charges against establishment politicians. It is no accident that Seattle's last elected socialist, Anna Louise Strong, was driven out of office in 1919 by a recall campaign for her links to the labor movement and opposition to World War I. The laws under capitalism are written by and for the elite, not for us. The genocide of native peoples and theft of their lands was legally sanctioned. The bloody institution of American slavery was once the law of the land, as was Jim Crow segregation. The lynchings that enforced segregation were not technically legal, yet no court would convict the lynchers. Today in Seattle, big business and the right wing are furious about the impact of socialist politics and social movements. They especially hate the inspiring example we have set for working people around the nation. After having failed at their attempt to steal the city council election in 2019, billionaires want a do-over and want to reverse the historic victories spearheaded by our office. The Amazon tax to fund social housing and Green New Deal projects, the $15 minimum wage, the first in the nation ban on weapons against weapons like tear gas against peaceful protest, and landmark renters' rights law like the ban on winter evictions, and our victory just on Monday this week for all tenants facing eviction to have the right to a lawyer. There's another election Amazon and Jeff Bezos are trying to steal, the union election by warehouse workers in Bessemer, Alabama. Because if the courageous efforts in Alabama are successful, it could lead to a major organizing drive at Amazon warehouses and other working places around the country. Members of my organization, Socialist Alternative, are in Alabama as we speak to do everything we can to support the union drive. This recall campaign is deeply undemocratic in every respect. The recall campaign manager said just yesterday that they did not want a general election vote because of the high turnout levels. Their preference is for a low turnout special election dominated by wealthy voters, and they make no bones about it. Our Socialist Council office has won unheard of victories for working people, but most importantly, we have built movements and empowered working people and marginalized communities, helping to lay the groundwork for future movements. We have been elected 3 times despite the corporate cash and the corporate lies. So now they have launched one of the most serious attacks on the US left in decades. But this is the capitalist system, and it's precisely because the ruling class so determinedly wants me off the city council that I know our office has fought for working people whose interests are opposed to the greed of the rich. The recall is a sign that the ruling class is deeply fearful of the growth of peaceful protests and workplace actions that are coming as the crisis of capitalism escalates. We have to fight back. So I urge all working people and community members to join us tomorrow, Saturday, April 3rd at 11 a.m. at Cal Anderson Park on Capitol Hill for a mask-on, socially distanced protest to defend against the recall. And we have to continue to use every ounce of energy of our council office to fight for working people. Renters, for example, are staring into a tsunami of evictions. So we have to build on our victory on Monday to also end default evictions, to close the loophole in Seattle's just cause protections against evictions. Most urgently, my office is getting ready to fight for families with school-aged children and for educators and school staff, including childcare and pre-K workers, to be protected against evictions during the school year. We need to fight for standardized lease terms, to end credit checks for working people who are renters. And ultimately, we also need to fight for rent control and to cancel COVID debt, including rental debt, utility debt, and mortgage payment debt, and unite the renters movement with working class homeowners and struggling small landlords and struggling small businesses. And we need to fight for a real Green New Deal, because we know that under the leadership of the Democrats in City Hall, Seattle is nowhere on target to reduce its emissions in time to reach its goals. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have to fight against this recall. Let's get together and let's do this.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Sawant. So now we are going to take questions from the press for about 10 minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time because the council member has to get to work. If press would like to ask a question, if you could please message me, Kaylin Nicholson, and then I will call on folks as requests come in. All right, well, if we have covered everything with the speakers already, then we can go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks again so much, everyone, for being here this morning. Thank you especially to everyone who spoke and shared your experience as activists and community members. We will look forward to seeing everyone on Saturday at 11 a.m. at Cal Anderson Park for the masked, socially distanced rally that Shama mentioned. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.